Well, it's great to be part of your Sunday school celebration service today. Just in case you're wondering who I am, my name is Josh. I'm married to Kathy. We have three children, Benjamin, Aaron, you saw earlier, and Matthew. And we're missionaries living in Windhoek, Namibia. And I've been a friend of the tab for 25 years or so. So I'm glad you're having a celebration today on the 7th of June because we are also celebrating a couple of things here. The first thing is it's my birthday, and if you're wondering, I'm now quite old. But the second thing that we're celebrating is that it was 13 years ago today that we first arrived in Namibia. Well, let's have a think about 1 Samuel chapter 17. I wonder if you've ever had this kind of experience. You're listening to a new song that you really like on the radio or one that you've downloaded, and you start singing along, but to be honest, you're not quite sure what the words are. And the words that you're singing don't really make a lot of sense. Well, that's what happened to me a number of years ago with a Christian song I really liked. Back then, in a world before Google, it was harder to find out what the real lyrics of a song were. I could understand most of the song, but there was one particular line that I was having a real problem with. They seemed to be singing this: I want to be a giant kipper lying on the floor. Now, that seemed to have nothing to do with the rest of the song, and it made me think of smelly fish. I knew those couldn't be the real words, but I also couldn't work out what they were really meant to be. It was only a number of years later that a friend of mine told me what the real words were, and it made a lot more sense. It turns out the words were not, I want to be a giant kipper lying on the floor. The actual words were, I want to be a giant killer relying on the Lord. It was all about 1 Samuel 17, and clearly better words to sing than one about a giant kipper. But looking back now, I realise that that line doesn't really get us to the heart of what's going on in this chapter. This story isn't teaching us that if we trust God, that we can somehow beat the giant problems of our lives. No, this story about David is finally about Jesus. And he's the giant killer, not us. So let's see how. We'll see this morning that this chapter tells us about PP, CC, and DD. It tells us about a powerless people, PP, a chosen champion, CC, and a divine deliverance, DD. First then, 1 Samuel 17 tells us about a powerless people, verses 1 to 11. So just imagine the scene in the valley of Elah. On one hill, you've got the Philistine battle line, and on another, you've got the Israelite battle line, and you've got the valley of Elah in between. And each group is waiting for the other one to make the first move down into the valley. And as the Israelites wait, Goliath, this impressive giant of a man with all the best armor and all the best weapons, makes fun of the Israelites. Goliath looks unbeatable. He's got everything going for him, it seems. And his suggestion is a simple one. He was the Philistine champion. All the Israelites needed to do was to send over their champion, and they would fight it out to the death, and so the battle would be decided. Day after day, morning and night, For 40 days, Goliath made fun of the Israelites and he made fun of God. And it was having a bad effect on the army of Israel. We read in verse 11, on hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. We're told in verse 24 that when Goliath turned up, the Israelites ran for it. They all fled from him, we're told, in great fear. Now, the people should have been able to turn to King Saul for help. He was the king of Israel, and he was also known for being very tall. He should have led his people into battle. But Saul was useless for one very simple reason. He was scared stiff of Goliath. The people were powerless. The king was powerless. They needed someone else. But who? Who was going to help them? The knees of Israel's finest were knocking together in fright because of Goliath as he shouted at them from the other side of the valley. Well, Israel's help was going to come from a surprising place. The fight wouldn't be won by somebody's big brother, but by someone's little brother. Enter David. He's the one who, in the chapter just before this one, has been secretly anointed by God as the future king. He's the one in this chapter who's only been trusted with carrying the picnic and being the messenger boy. But we need to remember that David has been chosen by God to be his champion. That's what we see next in verses 12 to 37. A chosen champion. David was probably in his late teens at the time of this story. His 3 older brothers were in the army that was staring across the valley at the Philistines that day. David probably wasn't old enough to be in the army yet. And so he's sent by his dad to travel the 12 miles or so to the battlefront to find out how his brothers are and to take them some food. And when he arrives, he hears Goliath shouting his usual poison at the Israelites, and the Israelites running in fear for their lives. But notice that David is annoyed by Goliath's words. Verse 26, he says someone needed to remove this disgrace from Israel. Who was this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? You see, David shows a faith in God that no one else seems to have that day. And that faith is the game changer here. This shepherd boy David, unlike King Saul, knew that he could face Goliath with confidence because his God was the living God. Well, if there was one thing that would have united both the Philistine army and the Israelite army, it was the idea that David couldn't win. But finally, David's willingness to fight for God and country is reported to King Saul, and he's brought before him. But Saul is not impressed by what he sees. You can see the way that his mind is working as he weighs up the opponents in verse 33. So in one corner, we have David, the shepherd boy. And in the other corner, we have Goliath, the skillful warrior. He is a man who's probably been fighting longer than David has even been alive. This was never going to work, Saul must have thought. But just listen to David's plucky reply to the king. He tells the king about his experiences of looking after the sheep in verse 36. This is what he says. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. You see, in David's eyes, Goliath was just like a wild lion or a bear that God would give him victory over, just as he had done many times before. Now, it's so important that we realize that David is able to beat Goliath not because of luck, not because of skill of some sort, not because he's smarter. No, David wins because God wins. This is God's victory. God is the real hero here. And so, King Saul sends David on his way with the very empty sounding words, verse 37, go and the Lord be with you. Which brings us to the last part of the story, in verses 38 to 58, a divine deliverance. David tries on Saul's armour and tries out Saul's swords, but he finds them too heavy, too clumsy to use. And so in the end, he fronts up to Goliath with just a sling in his hand and 5 smooth stones from the stream in his shepherd's bag. He wasn't ready to meet Goliath except for one thing. God was with him. Well, the final scene that this whole story so far has been leading up to is described. David meets Goliath. And I think it's fair to say that Goliath didn't take the idea of David as Israel's champion very well. They'd sent a teenager. Israel didn't seem to be taking him very seriously. We're told that he looked at David, verse 42, and despised him. He says to David, verse 43, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? This was probably not the time to explain that David saw him more like a lion or a bear. Goliath then calls down curses upon David in the name of his gods and calls him over so that he can finish him off, verse 44. This is what he says, come here and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. But David isn't worried by Goliath's threats and Goliath's so-called gods. He knows that he's coming against Goliath with the help of the living God. And David believed that the living God plus one teenager equals a victory. Listen to his faithful words in verse 45. He says this, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin. Pretty impressive by human standards. But I come against you, he says, in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. I come against you, says David, in the name of the living God, who is all powerful. David tells Goliath that everything that he said he was going to do to David, he would do to him. And it would happen today, verse 46. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I'll give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals. And this victory would happen to witness to the world and to Israel that God saves. It would happen, verses 46 to 47, so that the whole world will know, says David, that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it's not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. Well, we know how it all ends, don't we? David's first stone finds its target on Goliath's forehead. His armour proves to be no help at all. Goliath is stunned and at least knocked unconscious, which gives David the opportunity he needs to kill him with his own sword. He then cuts off his head. The Philistines run for their lives, and the Israelites chase after them and win a great victory because of David. Later, as the victorious army heads home, there's music and dancing, and the women sing, Saul has killed his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. The people of Israel celebrate the victory of their new champion. But let's get back to where we started. What does this 3,000-year-old story teach us today? Well, we need to realize that David here pictures a later, greater king. He's a model, if you like, for us of Jesus, who would come 1,000 years later. David is able to do what he does because he's a king who's been chosen by God and who's been filled with the Spirit of God to bring about this miracle. And his story points to the greatest of all kings, who was chosen by God and filled with God's Spirit to bring about the greatest of all miracles. Now, we don't have time to look this morning, but there are many places in the Old Testament after David has died where God's people long for another king like David. And there are many places in the New Testament where Jesus is described as being that king like David, but not just like him, greater than him. This story is in the Bible to tell us about Jesus and his victory. Jesus is God's chosen champion who fights for a powerless people to bring about a divine deliverance. Just think about the things that are true about David here that are also true about Jesus. Notice that Jesus, like David, wins his victory when everyone thinks he will be totally defeated. You see, Jesus is also an unexpected champion. He defeats death by his death on a Roman cross. Who would have believed it? That this blood-stained man hanging on the cross was winning the greatest victory this world has ever seen. Who would have believed it? Even his own disciples thought it was all over. But that was far from the truth. You see, the giant problem in our lives is not Goliath. No, our giant problem is sin. You see, too often we refuse to do things God's way. Too often we turn our backs on the good things that God has given us, and we treat God as if he's nothing. But when we live like that, we're actually headed for a fall. That sort of way of living messes us up, it messes other people up, and it leads to death. And we can't save ourselves from that problem. We're powerless. See, one day the Bible tells us we'll all stand before God and we'll answer for what we've done. And the Bible tells us that the only way to be safe on that day is if Jesus takes our punishment away. That's why we need what Jesus has done on the cross. You see, on that day on the cross, Jesus took God's anger for the wrong things we'd done. And he gave us the opportunity of being friends with God again, not just for this life, but forever. That's the very heart of the Christian message. We're a powerless people who need a chosen champion to bring about a divine deliverance. But don't you see, that's the good news of Jesus. Listen to these words from Romans chapter 5. Romans 5, 6 to 8. You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Romans 5 tells us about a powerless people, a chosen champion, and a divine deliverance. Listen to these words from Hebrews chapter 2, verses 14 to 15. Since the children have flesh and blood, Jesus too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. Hebrews 2 is about a powerless people, a chosen champion, and a divine deliverance. And like the Israelites, Christians are able to share in God's victory because of God's chosen king. Death is unable to harm us because Jesus has beaten its power. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 55 to 57 says this: Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, he gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. David's victory, remember, told the world that the battle is the Lord's, that God saves. And if that's true of his victory over Goliath, how much more is it true of Jesus' victory over sin and death? People all over the world need to know that Jesus has won a wonderful victory, a victory that they desperately need if they want their lives to change for good. But what about you? Have you realized that you need Jesus' victory over sin and death? Have you realized that you're in trouble without him? Well, if you have, then you need to talk to God this morning. And you need to ask him to change your life because of Jesus. It's only God who can do that sort of miracle. But that's exactly the sort of miracle that happens every single day when someone becomes a Christian. God saves people who can't help themselves through his chosen champion. Just like he did all those years ago in the valley of Elah when he sent a teenager to rescue his people from death. Our final song is all about Jesus being our rescuer and our King and our champion. Beautiful Saviour.